I dropped an email off to Diana Henriques, and I never know whether they go off into etherware or not. And I was so pleased to know that within a few hours, I got this wonderfully gracious note saying, geez, I've always wanted to speak at your conference. And that's a lot to say about Diana Henriques because her work is amazing. In 2003, she was part of the team that was named a Pulitzer finalist for the Enron scandal. She's won numerous awards for her financial coverage. Her most recent book, A First-Class Catastrophe, The Road to Black Monday, The Worst Day in Wall Street History, was published last year. And I just want to know where you were in October 1987. We were talking about this earlier, and we all have a memory about when the stock market crashed that day and what would happen the day after. She's also an amazing writer who covered Bernie Madoff during the days of his wizardry, right? He was a Wall Street darling, known as an innovator on Wall Street for any number of reasons. Until she got the call that day and saw the news alerts and chatted with her colleagues about this guy, Bernie Madoff, who was a scam artist. Well, the wonderful thing about this is that Diana went off and did this wonderful series of stories about Bernie, leading to her story, The Wizard of Lies, Bernie Madoff and the Death of Trust, which became a New York Times bestseller. And some of you have even seen this as an HBO series, The Wizard of Lies. She has a tremendous story talking about her encounter with Robert De Niro, the great actor, and how this journalist, who really just wanted to be a journalist because she told a great story, suddenly was sitting across the table from one Robert De Niro who said, "You're going to be the journalist in my movie." So ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to our new best friend and member of the Mayborn family, Diana Henriques.
What a great introduction. I can't tell you what a thrill it is to be here. Neil is absolutely right. Oh, I got it a little bit wrong. Everyone's an editor. Yeah, I always dreamed of the Mayborn, but I dreamed of being one of you. I dreamed of being somebody here to enjoy this weekend and to be here as one of the speakers. I feel like Cinderella at the ball, so thank you for having me. My congratulations to all of the winners whose work is being honored this weekend. I look forward to those confabs over coffee and Diet Coke and wherever, and so I'll be here through Sunday when we wrap things up, and I'm looking forward to a wonderful, wonderful weekend. Can everybody hear me okay? Back out there, raise your hand if you can hear me over in the corner. Good, good, good. I was a little worried when I saw the title that the program drafters had applied to my talk, pulling the curtain back on the powerful. I thought it made me sound a little bit like the guy in the shower scene in Psycho, you know. But okay, let's go with that. I shifted into financial reporting in 1982 after about a dozen years covering politics and government. Now, some of my colleagues at the time thought I was nuts. As they saw it, I was leaving the world of politics and government coverage where really important things happened and heading off into this strange new land called business news, where nothing I would investigate or write about would really matter much to the average American. Now, I knew they were wrong. I knew that the average American made political decisions maybe once, twice a year, and made business decisions once or twice a day. Which credit card? Buy or lease? Rent or get a mortgage? Most importantly, whom do you trust? Whom do you trust with your savings, with your college fund? Who do you trust with your financial wherewithal? That's where I came in. It was clear to me that the proper mission of investigative reporting was not just to hold those with political power accountable. God knows we need to do that, but it's not enough. We also have to hold those with financial and economic power accountable. And that's what I've tried to do for 35 years. I've exposed crooks and faulty investments and lazy directors and delinquent regulators, and I have had a ball. I'd do it all again. Now, a lot of things have changed in those 35 years. We didn't have iPhones back then. If you needed to look up corporate records, you had to order them from a data service, and they would come in big cardboard boxes. I see older friends, my friend Rex Saline, who was the business editor of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, who remembers those days. But something hasn't changed in those 35 years, unfortunately. Too many journalists, too many writers still think of that world of business as a separate country, somewhere far removed from the real world. Now, back in 1982, when I made that momentous transition, that mostly didn't matter much. As the financial press got bigger and smarter and more experienced, that old newsroom mindset just meant that a lot of reporters who weren't financially literate missed out on some extraordinary stories. Stock market crashes and failing S&Ls and the rise of Silicon Valley and more juicy true crime stories than you could shake a stick at. But today, that antiquated mindset does matter. We can no longer afford to treat the world of business and finance as a separate planet far away from the real world of government and politics. The wall that may once defensively have divided those two worlds has been weakened substantially by a long string of Supreme Court decisions, up to including Citizens United. And that wall was blown up completely by the Trump administration. Never in America's history have we had a president who is also the active owner of a global enterprise, a privately held company with no public reporting obligations, a private business that relies on financing, permits, partnerships, and market access around the world, the same world in which the American presidency operates. Now, love Trump or not, that's not the point. This is just a fact. It is unprecedented. And as writers, we've got to redraw our own mental maps to cope with that new reality if we want to write effectively about current events. Journalism has long defined its beats by buildings, right? You know, what do you cover? I cover the courthouse. I cover the State House. I cover town hall. I cover the school board. Buildings. We've got to stop doing that, folks, and we got to stop it now. The skills that financial investigative reporters have, tracing shell companies, tracking cases through bankruptcy, parsing financial statements, are now essential to covering the White House. Skills that political reporters have, following legislation through committees, tracking lobbyists and campaign donations, and keeping eyes on special interest groups. Well, those are now essential for covering the political activities of major businesses, including the ones owned by the president and his staff and his family. So please, expand your borders as writers. Deliberately start looking for stories in the unfamiliar intersection of business and politics, because the nation needs us to do this now, and we'll be richer for it as writers. I'm living proof that there's some heck of a good stories across that border. But when we do meld these two worlds, the problem identified as the overall theme of this great conference this weekend arises, doesn't it? How do you make these document-dense, number-studded stories readable? How do you make them entertaining? Well, I had a master class in making a business story entertaining when my book, The Wizard of Lies, was optioned in 2011 by HBO for adaptation as a TV movie, yes, starring Robert De Niro as Bernie Madoff. I'm sure that applause is for Robert, not me. As part of that deal, I was a consultant to the project. I'm not a script writer, and I didn't write the fabulous script for this film, but I worked with 3 amazing script writers and stayed with the project through production in 2015, eventually as playing myself in the film and recording the voiceover before the film was released last year. This was a transformative experience for me as a writer. First, I discovered that we think we revise a lot. Really? I mean, really. How many drafts did you do of that latest story? 5? 7? 10? Well, in the film business, each revision of the script is printed in color. It's given a name based on the color it is. So the early scripts are the usual primary colors. We've got the orange version, we've got the green version, we got the blue version, the yellow version. By the time we were done, we were up to lime, magenta, and goldenrod. I've never seen so much careful revision. It utterly changed the way I think about that aspect of our work. Then I quickly saw that movie scripts are intensely economical. I'd just like to read quickly a scene from the script of The Wizard of Lies in which Mark Madoff, Bernard Madoff's son, played by Alessandro Nivola, and yes, he is just as nice in person as he is on the screen. He's being interrogated by the FBI and the SEC after his father's arrest. So here goes. SEC. So you were never suspicious of your father? Never? Mark. Do you understand who he was? SEC. I think we all are beginning to understand. No, Mark said. He wasn't just my father. I'm going to have to use a little language here because it's from the script. He wasn't just my father. He was fucking idolized. You're talking about a man who created the modern market as we know it. He created NASDAQ. He was the chairman of NASDAQ, the chairman of the National Securities Clearing Corporation, chairman of the International Securities Clearing Corporation, chairman of the National Association of Securities Dealers, which was FINRA before FINRA fucking existed, chairman of the SIA Trading Committee, SEC. Okay, we understand your point, sir. I don't think you do. Chairman of the National Business Conduct Committee, sir, we understand. Member of the SIA Federal Regulation Committee, chairman of the NASD Small Order Execution Committee, SEC, sir, that's enough. Mark, and you're asking me how I didn't know? Well, I'm asking you. You're the FBI, you're the SEC, you've investigated him before, so I'm asking you, how the fuck did you not know? Okay, powerful, terrific, right? In that short scene, Mark Madoff's tantrum basically summarized 5 chapters from my book. The rise of Bernie Madoff to the position of respect he held on Wall Street. Now, obviously, I needed those 5 chapters to fully lay out the Madoff story. But from that moment, the moment I read that part of the script, I started thinking of ways I could have telescoped some of that backstory, some of those biographical details to speed the story along. And I used that lesson for the opening scene in A First Class Catastrophe, my book on the 1987 stock market crash. I needed to give the reader a sense of some big, mysterious, scary things that were changing on Wall Street and baffling regulators in the process. But instead of laying it out through explanation and historic trends, I opened in the middle of a market crisis in 1980 as regulators themselves were discovering the new hazards they faced. A lot of historical details were telescoped into that scene and to others that followed. Scene, I said. That's all you find in a movie script. It's just one scene after another, right? When the director is ready to roll, he yells, "Lights, camera, action." He does not yell, "Lights, camera, explanation." The premium on action scenes in a film is obvious. You don't have a movie without them. But they also give long-form narratives, their fuel, their juice, their power. Thriller writer Lee Child once observed that what he does, writing fiction, consists of making up things that didn't happen to people who don't exist. Our challenge, our thrill, is that we get to tell thrilling stories about things that did happen to people who do exist. But in both cases, things have to happen. And in so much of daily journalism, the most frequent activity displayed in our stories is people talking. So-and-so said such and such. So it was a revelation to me to come from a world where action scenes are rare, talking scenes are common, to a world where action scenes are everything. Constructing action scenes and realistic dialogue in scrupulously careful, fact-based narrative is very, very hard. I wish there were better news. There isn't. For starters, you need a valid, bulletproof basis for recounting every conversation. Now, I can tell you, people thumb through a book that doesn't have any dialogue in it, and they put it right back on the table. You gotta have it. You've gotta have dialogue, but you gotta stick with the truth. You need a valid, bulletproof basis for describing a character's inner thoughts, feelings, reactions, responses. So what do? You search tirelessly for transcripts, letters, journals, emails, depositions, affidavits, videos of speeches. And when you can't find any of those, you interrogate everyone you can find who heard a conversation, and you carefully reconstruct it, and then you test it against everybody else's version. And then finally, you have credible dialogue, credible thoughts, and reflections. If you see somebody saying something in one of my books, I have a valid basis for it, and you'll find it in the footnotes. If you see somebody thinking something in one of my books, it's in there because they wrote it down, they told me what they were thinking, or I found a journal or a letter or a note in which they explained it. You also need to describe the setting and the wardrobe and the lighting and the ambience, all the things that make a movie scene really come to life, elements that help the reader visually see the story you're trying to tell. Well, where do you get those? You need to dig into the Weather Underground website and the microfilm archives of the local paper to discover what was the weather that day. One of the key events in my account of the 1987 crash was the delivery of the Blue Ribbon Brady Commission's report to President Reagan. Now, every one of the stories that I'd seen about the delivery of that report, just basically report the team went to the Oval Office, met with the president, the vice president, a few others, handed over the report. There was a press conference, went on. That day was one of the worst blizzards in Washington's history. Airports were shut down, streets were shut down, tens of hundreds of thousands of federal workers were sent home. And I didn't know that till I started trying to write that scene. That's when I learned, when I went back to the people still living who were part of that, I said, how did you get to the White House? There's 2 feet of snow all over Wall Street, all over Washington. They said, oh, well, the White House sent a special SUV to pick us up at the hotel and take us over so that we could get there. Really? Didn't know that. So you visit the places where the scenes took place, if they're still intact, or you track down accurate photographs or film footage if you have to. You ask people, what did the place sound like? What did it smell like? And even when you've got an action film framed, it's got to rocket along. You need pacing. Now, I long used the trick that I'm sure you all do of reading my pages aloud in the first story to make sure that the pace doesn't flag. You've got a steady little metronome logging along there. So the pace doesn't lag, but is it the right pace? When I got the page proofs back for A First-Class Catastrophe, I was hysterical. You're not supposed to do anything there except catch the few little, typos and stuff like that. This is the page proof. This is what it's going to look when it's put between covers, There's a letter from the director of production says, this is not the point to rewrite your book. I read the early chapters and I was appalled. They did not move quickly enough. I called my editor. He was on the tarmac in Fort Lauderdale visiting his mother. I was in tears. I said, Paul, it's too slow. No one will get to Black Monday because I'll lose him in chapter 3. He said, no. He said, okay. I said, no, we have to do something. And to his credit, you always want an editor like this. He said, okay, go ahead, do what you need to do. He said, we'll pull the galleys off the second set of page proofs. We just won't even use these as page proofs. They'll slow us down a little bit. Go ahead and do it. So desperate now to speed up the pace of these early chapters, I developed a desperation measure. Desperate times require desperate measures, and the one I chose was Lee Child. Yep, my hero. I'd read a few paragraphs from some Lee Child thriller, deep in the back so I wouldn't actually keep turning the pages. And then I'd read a few paragraphs of me. And then I'd trim and tuck and shorten the words and shorten the sentences and tighten the paragraphs until I got as close as I could to Lee Child, his pace. And then I'd move on to the next few pages and do it all over again through the whole first half of the book. Now, obviously, there were some things that Lee Child would have thrown right out the window that I needed. I needed to keep some of that stuff in there. But I got as close as I could. Action is great, but fast-paced action is better. And explanation is necessary, but fast-paced explanation is better. Now, maybe a Lee Child thriller is not the right pace for your story. Maybe the pace for your story is some page-turning family saga. Or maybe the pace for your story is some unput-downable personal memoir. But find the pace, make it your pace car, and then try to keep up with that pace as you write. Next, you need to be as stingy with your cast of characters as any movie director facing a fixed budget for talent would be. Who really, truly needs to be in this story? Who can be a brief cameo or a nameless walk-on? Is there a hero? If not, who is at center stage? Who would get top billing in this movie? I got to tell you, the crowded stage is one of the biggest problems we face with nonfiction narratives, especially when we're trying to convert them into books or longer form stories. So many people, so many names. It's like a Russian novel. You just start blipping over the names, right? I had a terrible time with that. I never met a character in my story I didn't love, and the thought of shoving them off into the wings was just painful to me. So this is really, really hard for me. I'm still not as good at it as I want to be, but I'm sharing with you the insights I got from HBO. Pretend you're paying every one of them out of your own pocket at SAG scale. It helps. So slim down the cast as much as you can, but don't slim down the characters who make the cut. They need to be as beefy and robust, as deeply developed and distinctive as you can. If you were casting the movie for this story, which actor would play each of your characters? When you make that choice, ask yourself why. What were the traits that made you make that choice? And that will help you see what made that character distinctive. Find childhood photos, stories, yearbooks. Build a backstory for your characters, even if you don't include it in what you're writing, and usually you won't. Finally, seeing your book as a movie helps you figure out what it was really about. We all know the power of archetypal figures to draw readers into our story. If I say to an editor, listen, I've just really got this great Cinderella story, is there anybody in the room who's in any doubt about what the general shape of that story is going to be? What? Right, there's going to be some, little Cinder girl, some rags to riches story, right? If I say, listen, okay, it didn't turn out to be a Cinderella story, but it's a great David and Goliath story. Anybody in doubt about what that story is going to look like? There are dozens of cultural archetypes like that, and if you can find the one that gets closest without torturing the facts, that gets closest to your story, it can help you frame the shape of your story. Now, I felt like I'd done a pretty good job with Wizard of Oz. I felt like I'd gotten pretty deep into the core of the story. I considered a number of archetypes. I mean, is this Icarus? Is this King Midas? Is this the Emperor's New Clothes? Was a frequent suggestion. The Pied Piper, maybe. But I finally felt I'd figured it out. No. This is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This is light and dark, good and evil in one man. So I felt like I'd nailed that. I really dug deep. You know who dug deeper? The folks who wrote the tagline for the HBO movie. It says, "Only those you trust can truly betray you." Yep, that's it. That's the deeply felt threat that gave this Madoff story such timeless power and such universal reach. Smart editors have always told me, as I'm sure they've told you, write the headline for your story before you sit down to write it. It helps you crystallize the concept. It helps you be sure that you know what you're writing about. Now I go a step further. After I've written the headline, I write the movie tagline for the ads that will follow. So those are a few of the lessons that I learned in my brief but spectacular trip through Hollywood. Well, there were two other non-writing lessons I learned about how to blow dry really short hair and which foundation to use if you're going to be on camera. And if you're interested in that, you can see me later this weekend. But to cope with this extraordinary age, just to summarize, we've got to get better at turning essential but difficult stories, especially those at the intersection of business and politics, into essential but easy reading. And I hope these comments tonight have helped kick off what will be a weekend of conversation about that. Thank you for your attention. I'll look forward to your questions. field questions?
Yeah,
Sure,
no, you have to stay
absolutely.
around.
Great.
Don't go away. We're going to get some microphones set up because I'm sure you have many, many more questions, and not just about Robert De Niro, right?
Right. He's a very nice guy.
There you go. I'll kick it off as we get the mics set up. I mean, you allude to the issue of how we have to do better in telling these stories nowadays. And what we're finding, as everyone will talk about, and we all know, is this pace of news is happening very quickly, and many of the stories are very complicated. Yeah. And suddenly we're trying to condense them into these short, really almost vapid kind of pieces. Help us figure out how we, battle this time crunch,
right,
this intense news cycle, and do what you just said, which you got to be diligent, but you've got to tell good stories along the way.
I'm glad you saved the softball question for first. Look, I know these stories are hard, and I know that the pace of news breaking now is stunning. It's really, I don't want to say unprecedented because I'm old enough to remember Watergate, and I'm old enough to remember the meltdown of 2008 when we literally thought the ATMs were going to go dark every day. So I know that these are challenging times. I have been impressed with the extraordinary investigative journalism that these times have pulled forth. And how much good storytelling is being done. I don't know about you, but I can't put the Maria Butima story down. I mean, the Russian alleged spy in Washington, I want the movie rights to that. But the problem is we haven't got enough time to get enough distance. We don't have enough time to get enough perspective on what's really happening. So let me throw some of my early remarks right back at you. What's the theme of this story we're covering now? What's the archetype of this story we're covering now? If we were making Trump the movie, what would its ads tagline be? We can play with that all weekend long, but that's how we're going to get to the point where we can sift through a lot of the noise, necessary noise in many cases, and lift up the bones of the really strong stories. It may be too soon. Some great people are already doing it. I mean, as I say, I am voracious about the journalism that's coming out of this extraordinary period of life. And truly, this is the most remarkable life in the political chapter of this country in my lifetime and probably in the last half century. And it is producing astonishing journalism. But it's going to make better storytellers of us because we're going to have to reach everybody. These are not stories we're telling each other. These are stories we're writing for people who don't want to read us. So I think it's an enormous challenge, and the most I can do is suggest that some of what I've talked about here tonight is applicable to the problems that we face. Yes?
Hello, thank you. Let's see. Is this on? Hello? Okay. Thanks so much for talking about craft. I have a question about the financial system. Bernie Madoff was one extreme of a schemer. Alan Stanford here in Texas was another kind. And the difference was that unlike Bernie Madoff, Alan Stanford had nothing behind him to recommend him as a financial wizard except all of the public testimonials of his good smarts and character that he bought. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering, talk about trust. What happened with him was he co-opted all the things that were supposed to protect investors to make himself look acceptable or safe. Yeah. Coming away from that, looking at the law firms and the banks and the insurers, all of whom have done nothing for the clients, how much faith do you have in the system? Like all of our gold-plated financial security seem to
I'm not passing up on your question, but I did a TED Talk, a TEDx Yale, which you can find online, about the limits of trust, really. Trust is a two-edged sword. We cannot run a modern economy without it, truly. I mean, how many of you did any online shopping this week? Yeah, pure trust. Pure trust. You have no idea who you were dealing with, what they were going to do with your credit card number. You hoped that they would send you the product that you'd ordered, right? Pure trust. We can't run a modern economy without trust. But if trust alone is what you're relying on to manage your money, you're in real trouble. Because people like Madoff, like Stanford, like I could go on and on, Scott Rothstein, don't get me started. The records show that between 2002 and today, a new Ponzi scheme surfaced on average every 5 days. So by this time next week, we'll have a new one, right? But they all are being run right now. I mean, say there's new Ponzi schemes operating out there right now. They're being run by people who are completely and absolutely trusted, because someone you trust is the only person who can pull you into a Ponzi scheme. Now, what Stanford did was a little different than what Madoff did. Madoff built a personal reputation on Wall Street among people who knew him and respected him. Stanford hijacked a lot of other credible institutions. Big difference in the script they were following. Every Ponzi schemer follows a script. Bernie's script was, well, I'm investing in a diversified portfolio of S&P 500 stocks and balancing the downside with treasury bills and cash. Stanford's cover story was, these are bank CDs. Offshore bank, regulated by the authorities in Antigua, paying a few percentage points, 2 percentage points more than U.S. CDs. Well, bank CDs, good Lord, what could be more trustworthy than that? So, trust alone is a very dangerous way to manage your money. And saying, oh, well, the regulators should have caught it, doesn't cut it with me. I'm sorry, this is self-help here. You need to recognize your own responsibility for money management. That having been said, I do have some concerns about the funding of the regulatory system. I have a massive concern about this stubborn and stupid idea of deregulating the financial system. You might as well deregulate traffic. It makes just about as much sense. But these are ongoing conversations. I don't know which is worse, tearing down all the regulators and putting them out of business, or unfunding them so that you think you have a regulatory system when they actually don't have any money to do their job. Either way, we still have to take personal responsibility. Is that helpful? Good. Okay. Yeah, George. Did I have to join SAG? I did. And I did get scale. And in fact, I got a note from something called Cast and Crew just 2 weeks ago telling me that I'd never picked up my last paycheck. And they were going to turn it over to the state of New York if I didn't send them a form to tell them where to send it. So I've got another $113 heading my way. Happy to report. I worked at SAG. I had to sign it was so much fun. I had to sign my timesheet every day. I got to eat at the little mess the catering people would set up every day. I was like a kid in a candy store being behind the scenes at the making of a movie, and just don't get me started on it because we'll be here all night. It was just a hoot. Yeah.
Who specifically are you reading at the intersection right now of business and politics? And also, has this experience with Hollywood, and I love the idea of writing, adopting some of the principles of screenwriting for what we do, but has this changed how you think about audience?
Oh, what a great question. Now remind me of what the first one was, because I love that one so much.
Who specifically are you reading who's doing this right at the intersection of business and
right
politics?
Now, yes. Really, there's some really good people writing in The Atlantic. Franklin Foer is one. Jim Fallows has a great new book out on that. Roger Lowenstein has always been great and strong on that intersection. Michael Lewis is one of my idols in the craft of making thrilling stories out of finance and business. I have not read all of the books that have been coming out of the Trump era. I mean, I'm trying to work on my own book. I mean, you can read books or you can write books, but apparently you can't do them both. But so I haven't read all of them. I haven't seen a lot of that finance corner of the intersection in the ones that have been hugely successful so far, although Russian roulette does come close. And David Farenthold at the Washington Post is doing a superb job. As I tell his boss, Marty Barron, whenever I see Marty, that he is doing a superb job of blending those two worlds. So those are some. I mean, I can't wait to see what happens with David next. He's really going to be he's going to lead the way that I'm trying to point to in the work that he's doing. Okay. And there was a second question. How has it? Oh, the screenwriting. Yes. How's it changed my sense of audience? Well, it is a little lowering, you know, to realize that tens of thousands of people, including dozens of my own relatives, never read my book but loved the movie. Yeah, I know. But in a weird way, it gave me hope about reaching audience, because I felt that when we get as good at telling our stories as Hollywood is, we're going to find an audience we never dreamed was possible before. So we're not there yet. And when I tell you need to do more stories about finance/politics, you're going to say, oh, God, they've got all those numbers in them that'll never get us there. But I do think that seeing the audience that HBO created for that story. This is a story about a con artist. It involved Wall Street. It involved numbers. It involved finance. And it was the third top-ranked debut movie for HBO in its history. So that gives you hope, you know, that if you can tell a story about a Wall Street charlatan with that kind of power, you can find an audience. So it was it's a little humbling, but yet also a little encouraging. Others? Yes.
Hi. Do you do an outline, or how do you plan out how you're going to structure your stories or your books when it's like a long form and involving a lot of scenes?
Yeah. One of the first things I do when I'm organizing a story is start building a timeline. I've mentioned this to some of the students who were talking with me earlier before dinner. A chronology, a master chronology. By the end of the 1987 book, the master chronology was like 300 pages in an e-file, so they're big. But every time I learned a fact and knew when it happened, I put it at the right spot in the chronology. This is just to me, it's always been an essential tool, whether it was a Sunday feature for the business section or whether it was a long-form narrative investigative project. You have to have clear in your mind a sense of what happened when, and then what happened next, and what had happened before. So the first thing I do is start figuring out the timeline. Outlining is sort of in the mind of the beholder. I'm not sure if what I do is necessarily outlining, but I do try to find the architecture of a story, you know, figuring out what foundation it has to go up on and what has to come next and what has to come next. So I do tend to sort of write those out. Some of you may know, because you've heard me talk before, that I use voice recognition software to do all of my writing. I was injured with carpal tunnel injury in 1998, which just stubbornly would not get better. And so since '98, when it was introduced, I've used, this is not a plug, Dragon at Naturally Speaking as a continuous voice recognition program, and I've done all of my writing that way. And you know, since you're just sort of speaking these things, I found it helpful to have a list of the points I wanted to cover. But the key essential first step for me is formulating that chronology. I think I basically am, you know, in another life, I'm a historian somewhere, you know, and this is the holdover for that. I need to know the order in which things happened. Yeah, Cassandra, good to see you.
Good to see you. So you're obviously very good at what you do, but how, as a young writer, did you start working on these narrative skills, and what were some mistakes that you made?
Well, one of the mistakes I made was I didn't work on my narrative skills. I was a reporter's reporter, as the editors used to say. I never met a fact I didn't like. If you gave me 5 hours to do a story, any editor can tell you, if you gave me 5 hours to do a story, I would report for 4 hours and 45 minutes, because I knew I could do a fairly decent job of slapping a story together in the remaining 15 minutes and make my deadline. And I kept doing that through my young years. And, you know, editors loved it because, you know, they could be sure that I would get that last phone call in and still make my deadline. And you know, I finally woke up. Let me spare you that journey. You know, I said, you know, I'm just never going to get any better as a writer if I don't spend more time writing. And that means the deadline isn't going to change. I'm still going to have 5 hours to do this story, but I've got to spend more of that time creating a story that people will read. I think this is harder if you actually have some skill as a journeyman journalist. I'd started writing newspaper stories when I was the age of these people in the green T-shirts. I fell in love with journalism in high school and started writing my first stories in high school, and I was good enough to get jobs. You know, I wasn't a great writer, but I was good enough to get jobs. Well, let me tell you, the threat of being good enough, you know, I never was pushed to get better. So a regret that I have is I did not start sooner to spend more time on the storytelling skills that I needed. So my advice to the younger reporters is don't make the mistake I did. Start sooner. You'll get better sooner. So thank you. Other questions? I realize I'm all that's standing between you and the bar, so I don't, if it's an important question, you know, that's great. Sorry, go right ahead. Yeah.
I'm doing it again. Sorry. Michael Lewis, it was announced, is lately going straight to Audible versus writing these 10,000-word pieces for Vanity Fair. I imagine that's also a question about audience, right? We're talking about
yeah, the podcast generation.
What I'm struggling with, the ways in which to find audience, the best ways. And I wonder if you've thought about that, if you have ideas about that, have you been offered that?
I've talked a lot about, I'm mystified by the great podcast phenomenon because I can read something a lot faster than you can read it to me, but friends are trying to bring me along. They've done interventions and they're starting to, you know, get me to the point where I really enjoy certain podcasts, and I'm beginning to see that, you know, I got news for you again. This was radio in the 30s and 40s, right? You know, there's nothing new under the sun. These were radio shows. That's what you're listening to. We just didn't know to call them podcasts back then. Not that I was alive back then, but I'm learning a lot of the different tools that are available to us now, and I'm really a high school student in my understanding of them and my adoption of them, but I sure am interested. I don't think you can be a writer who likes to write books, who likes to write articles these days and not be working like crazy to understand the way technology is changing the way we deliver that final product. So I'm studying. I hope to learn a lot from some of you the weekend while I'm here, and look forward to hearing a lot about multimedia storytelling, a lot about podcast storytelling, and a lot about how technology can give more audience to what we do. Yes. I know. Numbers, arithmetic. That's the problem. Number phobia. I meet it all the time, George. Let me tell you something. Pick up a basic, annual report, a basic proxy statement from American Corporation and go through it. There are thousands of times more words than numbers in that document. So the notion that because it's got some numbers in it, it's somehow beyond your reach is silly. It's just absolutely silly. But number phobia, to me, is one of the biggest obstacles we face in getting good, talented people into this world. I meet young journalists, God help us, who don't know how to calculate percentage change. How many of you could confidently tell me that if revenues went from 8 million to 10 million, how much did they change percentage-wise? I know, show off over there, my business journalism friends, but if you are not sure you can answer that question and get it right, then you need to do some remedial work. And I do workshops. I go all over the place. There are all kinds of places you can go. The University of Arizona's Cronkite School of Journalism has a great website devoted entirely to business journalism with all kinds of tutorials, all kinds of helpful information. The Reynolds Foundation has run a lot of useful work. You can ask people. Start reading financial press. Start reading the stories that are being written in this world, and get your mind around it. Because I tell you that when I say that we need to cover the intersection between finance and politics, that requires financial literacy of every journalist. It always amazed me that an editor who would never dream of hiring a sports writer who didn't know the difference, who wouldn't dream of hiring, say, a business writer who didn't know the difference between baseball and soccer, would readily hire a sports writer who didn't know the difference between a stock and a bond. Editors have never expected other parts of the newsroom to be financially literate. Bad on you. That's got to change. Every person on your staff has got to have a basic financial literacy, because it's all one world now, gang. Business escaped its natural borders. It's consumed everything. You can't cover welfare, you can't cover sports, you can't cover education, you can't cover the arts, you can't cover fashion, you can't cover anything today if you don't have a basic understanding about business. So, George, from your lips to God's ears here, this is a world with great stories, great characters. It is critically important to the people who read and listen and hear your stories. You just got to get over the number thing, okay?